The message arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning at the United Earth Embassy in New York. It came through the standard channels, just like any other space transmission, but its contents were anything but ordinary. The Galactic Council, after decades of ignoring humanity's attempts at contact, had finally sent an invitation. James Walker stood at the window of his office, looking out at the morning traffic below. His reflection showed a man in his 50s, with gray hair and calm blue eyes. He held a datapad in his hands, reading the invitation for the 10th time that morning. "They're not even trying to hide their contempt," he said to the empty room. The invitation's wording was polite on the surface, but Walker had spent 30 years in diplomacy. He could read between the lines. The Council's message described humans as an emerging spacefaring species that has recently achieved basic faster-than-light travel capabilities. Walker knew what that really meant. They saw Earth as primitives who had just discovered fire. Below his office, the streets buzzed with the usual mix of ground cars and personal flying vehicles. Above them, massive clean energy collectors floated in the sky, powering the city with zero emissions. Humanity had come far in the last century, but the Council didn't know that. They didn't know a lot of things about Earth, and Walker intended to keep it that way. "Ambassador Walker," his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The President is ready for your call." Walker straightened his jacket and sat down at his desk. The holographic display came to life, showing the President's office. "James," the President nodded. "I assume you've read it." "Yes, Madam President. They're finally acknowledging us, though not in the way we hoped." The President's expression was grim. "The intelligence reports about the Council's treatment of new species." "All confirmed," Walker replied. "They invite new species to join, then force them into unfair trade agreements. Those who refuse face economic sanctions or worse. And they expect us to just accept this." Walker allowed himself a small smile. "They do. They've done this for thousands of years. New species either submit or get crushed by the combined might of the Council races. But we're not going to do either, are we?" "No, Madam President. I have a different approach in mind." Walker pulled up some files on his screen. "They think we're primitive because that's what we've let them see. Our deep space probes, our early FTL tests, we've been careful to make them look unrefined." The President leaned forward. "You want to continue this deception. The Council has ruled through fear and corruption for millennia. They're arrogant, set in their ways. They won't see us as a threat." Walker's eyes gleamed. "That will be their mistake." 2 weeks later, Walker stood in his quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel Terra's Hope, preparing for their arrival at the Celestial Forum. The massive space station served as the seat of the Galactic Council, where representatives from hundreds of species gathered. The ship's AI announced their approach. Walker walked to the observation deck, watching as they dropped out of FTL. The station came into view. A massive structure that looked like a silver flower blooming in space, its petals stretching for kilometers. "Incoming transmission from Celestial Forum Control," the AI announced. The controller's voice was heavily accented but understandable. "Earth vessel, maintain your current speed. You will be directed to the outer docking rings, where representatives of lesser species are accommodated." Walker noticed the slight pause before lesser species. He kept his voice pleasant as he acknowledged the instructions. A small transport ship approached to guide them in. Through its windows, Walker could see the pilot, a tall, blue-skinned being who barely glanced at their ship. Just another primitive species arriving to be processed, cataloged, and controlled. As they docked, Walker reviewed his mission briefing one last time. The Council had no idea that Earth's technology was decades ahead of what they'd shown. They didn't know about the quantum communications network, the advanced AI systems, or the revolutionary defense technologies. Most importantly, they didn't know that every piece of technology on Walker's ship was carefully designed to look crude and inefficient while gathering massive amounts of data about the station and its inhabitants. The docking clamps engaged with a thud. Walker straightened his simple Earth diplomatic uniform, deliberately designed to look slightly outdated by galactic standards. It was time to meet the council, to play the role of an eager, naive representative of a young species. Time to begin the game. The main council chamber was designed to intimidate. Walker knew this the moment he stepped inside. The ceiling rose at least 50 meters high, with floating platforms arranged in ascending rings. The higher a species' status, the higher their platform, and Earth's assigned spot was nearly at the bottom. Walker took his seat, noting how the simple chair was slightly uncomfortable for human body structure. Not an accident, he thought. Around him, representatives from other newer species shifted uneasily in their seats. Above them all, the 5 council races looked down from their elevated positions near the ceiling. The council recognizes the representative from Earth, announced the chief speaker, a tall being with golden scales. The voice carried a tone one might use when speaking to a child. You may present your petition for associate membership. Walker stood, activating the simple holographic display they'd been permitted to bring. It flickered slightly, exactly as planned. Honorable Council, he began, his voice steady. Earth comes before you with great respect for the ancient traditions of galactic civilization. He noticed several council members barely hiding their smirks. We offer our achievements and hopes to join this grand assembly. The display showed images of Earth's newest technologies, carefully selected to appear promising but primitive. A council member from the upper rings interrupted, their voice dripping with amusement. We see you've managed to achieve basic matter conversion for your FTL drives. Quite impressive for your development stage, though the efficiency ratings are rather poor. Laughter rippled through the chamber. Walker maintained his pleasant expression, even as he noticed one of the younger council aides watching him with unusual interest. We're still learning, Walker said humbly. Earth would greatly benefit from the council's guidance. Another council member, a being with crystalline features, spoke up. Speaking of guidance, we have prepared a standard trade agreement for Earth. Nothing complicated, just some basic terms to ensure smooth integration into galactic society. Walker accepted the data crystal they sent down. His simple scanner took far longer than necessary to read it, earning more chuckles from the assembly. But while they laughed, the scanner was copying and analyzing every bit of data, including the hidden code layers they thought primitive systems couldn't detect. We'll need time to study this, Walker said carefully. Our translation systems are still basic. Of course, the golden-scaled chief speaker said, though do try to be quick about it. These agreements are standard procedure. All new species sign them. Walker noticed how several representatives from newer species tensed at those words. Their body language told stories their voices couldn't. As the session continued, Walker played his role perfectly, asking simple questions, showing just enough intelligence to be taken seriously, but never enough to be seen as a threat. All the while, his supposedly primitive equipment gathered terabytes of data about the council chamber systems, communications, and security measures. After the session, Walker walked slowly through the station's lower levels, where newer species were housed. He felt eyes following him, some curious, some sympathetic, thinking Earth would soon join them in economic servitude to the council. The young aide he'd noticed earlier was waiting near his quarters. Ambassador Walker, the aide said quietly. I'm Tom. I need to talk to you about the trade agreements. Walker studied the aide carefully. Come inside, he said, activating his room's basic privacy field, while the much more sophisticated one hidden in his clothing blocked any real surveillance. Tom spoke quickly once they were private. The agreements, they're not what they seem. The council, they use them to buy newer species into economic slavery. Walker finished. Yes, we suspected as much. Tom looked startled. You knew. Walker allowed himself a small smile. There's a lot we know, Tom. And perhaps there's something you'd like to tell me about why a senior council aide is working in the lower levels. Tom's eyes widened. He hadn't mentioned he was a senior aide. I think, Walker said, taking out a data pad that looked simple but contained quantum-encrypted communications technology. We have a lot to discuss. Outside the window, the endless space traffic flowed around the Celestial Forum, while inside, the first pieces of Walker's plan began falling into place. 3 weeks had passed since Walker's first council session. In his quarters, he studied the holographic display showing a web of connections. Each line represented money, favors, or secrets flowing between council members. The display looked basic to anyone watching through the station's surveillance, but the real data flowed through quantum channels they couldn't detect. The Blue Star Empire has been overcharging new species for jump gate access, Tom said, pointing to one cluster of data. They split the extra profits with the Crystal Confederation. Walker nodded, adding the information to his growing map of corruption. And the newer species can't complain because the trade agreements they signed make it legal, Tom finished, or at least appear to make it legal. A quiet alert chimed. Someone was approaching. Tom quickly switched the display to show simple trade statistics as the door chimed. It was a representative from one of the newer species, the Delton system. Walker had been expecting him. Ambassador Walker, the Delton said, his leaf-like skin rustling nervously. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Representative Green. Walker smiled, using the simple name the Delton had chosen for council interactions. Please, sit. Green's eyes darted to Tom, but Walker nodded reassuringly. Tom has been helping me understand council protocols. Did you bring the trade records we discussed? The Delton pulled out a data crystal. 5 years of shipping manifests. The council claims these rates are standard, but he trailed off, his leaves drooping. Walker inserted the crystal into his reader. The device made a show of struggling with the data format, but within seconds had copied and decoded everything. Thank you. This will help build a clearer picture. After Green left, Tom looked at Walker. That's the 4th representative this week. How are you getting them to trust you? Walker smiled. The council's greatest weakness is their pride. They see Earth as primitive, harmless. That makes other species feel safe talking to me. He paused. And they're tired of being cheated. The next day, Walker attended a minor trade committee meeting. As usual, he sat quietly, asking occasional simple questions that made the council members shake their heads in amusement. But today it was different. When they discussed new shipping rates for the outer sectors, Walker spoke up. Excuse me, but these numbers seem odd. He fumbled with his data pad, playing up his confusion. According to standard market rates, these fees are 3 times higher than they should be. The room went quiet. A council member from the Crystal Confederation leaned forward. And how would Earth know about standard market rates? Oh, we've been studying, Walker said innocently. Our ships may be slow, but they can still collect public market data. See, he displayed a chart that looked crude but contained hidden layers of damning evidence. The council member laughed, but Walker caught the nervous edge in it. Public data is often incomplete or incorrect. Trust the council's experience in these matters. Walker nodded apologetically. Of course. Just trying to understand. But he noticed how some of the newer species representatives were now looking at their own data pads with fresh suspicion. Later, in a secure communication with Earth, Walker reported his progress. The president's hologram looked pleased. The pieces are moving into place, Walker explained. Every day, more species come to us with evidence. The council's corruption is vast, but it's also fragile. They've gotten sloppy, thinking no one could challenge them. And the defense systems we detected, the president asked. Just as we thought. Advanced, but heavily reliant on AI systems that haven't been updated in centuries. They think their technology is unbeatable because no one has challenged it in so long. And our countermeasures? Walker smiled. Ready, but hidden. The council's scans show exactly what we want them to see. An eager young species barely managing to keep their ships running. The president nodded. Keep going. Earth stands ready. After the call ended, Walker looked out at the glittering expanse of the Celestial Forum. Somewhere in those halls, council members were laughing about Earth's primitive technology and simple questions. Soon, they would learn just how expensive that laughter would become. The Grand Chamber buzzed with excitement. Today was the annual Trade Agreement Review, where the council would announce new rates and regulations. Walker sat in his usual lower position, watching the proceedings with careful attention. The chief speaker stood at the highest platform, his golden scales gleaming. We will now review the adjusted trade rates for the outer sectors. As always, these changes are for the benefit of all species. Walker checked his simple data pad one last time. Months of gathering evidence had led to this moment. Beside him, Tom sat very still, trying not to show his nervousness. For the coming cycle, the chief speaker continued. Transport fees will increase by 30%. This is necessary for improved security and maintenance. Walker stood up slowly. A question, if I may. Several council members sighed, clearly expecting another naive query from the primitive human. The chief speaker nodded with obvious amusement. Yes, Earth representative. I'm curious about these maintenance costs. Walker's voice was calm as his fingers moved across his data pad. Would the council be willing to share the maintenance records for the last 10 cycles? That information is restricted. A Crystal Confederation member snapped. The council's decisions do not require justification. Walker nodded apologetically. Of course. It's just. He pressed a final button on his pad. These records seemed to tell a different story. The chamber's main display suddenly came to life. Lists of transactions appeared, showing money flowing from transport fees into private accounts. More data followed. Secret meetings, hidden agreements, decades of systematic theft. What is this? The chief speaker demanded, his scales darkening with anger. Public records, Walker said simply, though some were harder to find than others. Interesting how much information is actually available if you know where to look. Those records are fake, another council member shouted, but Walker could see the fear in their eyes. Are they? Walker turned to address the whole chamber. Representatives of the outer sectors, check your own records. Compare the maintenance fees you've paid against the actual work done. The data is there. The room erupted in activity as dozens of representatives began searching through their files. The council members watched helplessly as their careful system of lies began to unravel. This is outrageous, the chief speaker thundered. You dare to accuse the council. I'm not accusing anyone, Walker interrupted calmly. I'm simply sharing information. Information that has already been sent to every major news network in council space. That caused an even bigger stir. The council members huddled together, speaking urgently in their private communication channels. But Walker had one more card to play. Oh, and you might want to check your secure networks, he added. It seems they're not as secure as you thought. The Crystal Confederation member laughed nervously. Our systems are the most advanced in the galaxy. A primitive species like yours couldn't possibly. Walker held up his simple data pad. On its screen, the council's private messages scrolled past, including the panicked ones they were sending right now. How? The chief speaker's voice trailed off. Earth isn't quite as primitive as you assumed. Walker's voice carried clearly through the shocked silence. While you were laughing at our basic technology, you never thought to question why it sometimes worked better than it should. He stood up straighter, addressing the entire chamber. The council has exploited newer species for centuries, hiding behind laws you created and security systems you thought were unbeatable. That ends today. The chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives from newer species were shouting demands for investigations. Council members were frantically trying to contain the damage. And through it all, Walker stood calmly, watching as the corrupt system began to crack. Tom leaned close to him. They'll try to stop this from spreading. Walker smiled. They already can't. Earth's quantum communication network has been operating through their systems for months. Every piece of evidence is already public. The galaxy is watching. Above them, the council members were learning a harsh lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who threatens you with force, but the one who simply shows everyone the truth. Walker stood at the window of his quarters, watching ships arrive at the Celestial Forum in greater numbers than ever before. News of the Council's corruption had spread faster than even he had expected. His datapad beeped with another urgent message. The fourth emergency session had been called in 2 days. "They're getting desperate," Tom said, looking at the latest reports. "The Blue Star Empire is threatening to cut off trade routes to Earth." Walker smiled. "Let them try." He turned from the window. "How many ships did you count in the defense fleet they've gathered?" 300 warships, Tom replied. "The largest fleet assembled in 50 years. And how many of them can actually fight?" Tom checked the data. "What do you mean?" "They're all..." "Oh." His eyes widened as he looked at the maintenance records. Half of them haven't had real combat upgrades in over a century. The door chimed. A group of representatives from the outer sectors entered, species that had been exploited by the Council for generations. They looked nervous but determined. "Ambassador Walker," their spokesperson said, "we've received threats from the Council. They say if we support Earth, they'll activate the hidden protocols in our trade agreements." Walker nodded. "The ones that would shut down your defense systems and lock your ships in dock." They stared at him in surprise. "How did you?" "Those protocols were deleted 3 weeks ago," Walker said calmly. "Check your systems." They quickly consulted their datapads, amazement spreading across their faces. "But our best engineers said those locks were unbreakable." "Earth has been busy," Walker explained. "While the Council laughed at our primitive technology, we were studying theirs. They haven't updated their core security systems in centuries. They never thought they needed to." The chamber's emergency alert sounded. Another session was starting. As they walked to the grand chamber, Walker could feel the tension in the air. The council members sat in their high platforms, but their usual confidence was gone. The chief speaker's voice shook with barely controlled anger. "Earth representative, you have caused enough disruption. The Council hereby orders Earth to cease all interference in Council systems. Comply or face immediate sanctions." Walker stepped forward. Interesting choice of words. Orders. That's the problem, isn't it? The Council is used to giving orders, not having conversations. "This is your final warning," the Crystal Confederation member threatened. "Our fleet stands ready." Walker held up his simple datapad. "You mean the fleet that's currently receiving new navigation commands?" Alarms began blaring throughout the station. On the main display, they watched as the mighty Council fleet began moving, but not in formation. Each ship turned in a different direction, their weapons powering down. "What have you done?" the chief speaker demanded. "Nothing harmful," Walker assured them. "Just demonstrated that Earth's primitive technology can take control of your ships more easily than you can. Would you like to see what else we can do?" The chamber erupted in shouts and accusations. Walker waited for them to quiet down before continuing. "For centuries, you've ruled through fear and technology you barely understand anymore. You thought your power was absolute. But while you were laughing at new species, those species were learning, adapting, evolving." He gestured to the representatives from the outer sectors. "These people trusted you to lead fairly. Instead, you exploited them. That ends now. You dare threaten the Council?" The Crystal Confederation member sputtered. "No threats," Walker said calmly. "Just facts. Earth doesn't want to rule the galaxy. We want to change it. The choice is yours. Help us build a fair system for all species, or watch your power crumble as everyone learns just how weak you really are." The council members looked at each other in growing panic. Their perfect system of control was falling apart, undone by the species they had dismissed as primitive. And Walker knew this was just the beginning. The Celestial Forum was in chaos. Protests filled the public levels as representatives from hundreds of species demanded justice. The Council's private security forces tried to maintain order, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. Walker watched from his office as another group of ships arrived. Refugees from Council worlds where people had risen up against their corrupt leaders. His data pad showed similar scenes playing out across Council space. The Crystal Confederation has closed its borders, Tom reported, rushing into the office. They're threatening to use their planetary defense systems against any ships that try to enter their space. Walker nodded calmly. And how are those defense systems working for them? Tom checked his pad and smiled. Not well. None of their weapons will power up. They keep getting error messages about routine maintenance. The door opened again. A group of Council security officers entered, their weapons drawn. Ambassador Walker, their leader, announced, "You are under arrest for crimes against the Council." Walker didn't move from his chair. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. The officer raised his weapon, then looked confused when it wouldn't fire. None of their weapons would work. "Earth's been studying Council technology for months," Walker explained. "Did you really think we'd miss something as basic as weapon systems?" The officers backed away, their useless weapons falling to the floor. Through the window behind them, Walker could see more ships arriving. But these weren't protesters or refugees. These were warships. The private fleets of Council members making one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "They're threatening to bombard the station," Tom said, checking the incoming messages. "They say if we don't surrender control of the communication networks, they'll—" Walker held up his hand. "Watch." On the main display, they could see the Council warships moving into attack position. But as they tried to power up their weapons, something strange happened. Every ship's systems suddenly went dark. When they came back online, new messages flashed across their screens. "What did you do?" Tom asked in amazement. "Showed them Earth's real defense technology," Walker replied. "We don't build bigger weapons. We make weapons unnecessary." The station's speakers crackled. The chief speaker's voice rang out, trying to sound confident but failing. "This is your final warning. Return control of Council systems, or—" "Or what?" Walker interrupted, pressing a button on his pad to broadcast to the entire station. "You'll use the weapons we've disabled, the fleets we've shut down, the security forces whose equipment won't work." He stood up, walking to the window. "For centuries, you've ruled through fear and force. But you forgot something important. True power isn't about having the strongest weapons. It's about having the smartest defenses." Screens throughout the station came to life, showing more evidence of Council corruption, not just the bribes and threats, but the hidden accounts where they'd stored their stolen wealth, the secret prisons where they'd kept those who opposed them. "Earth could have come here with warships," Walker continued. "We could have tried to fight you with weapons. But we chose a different path. We studied, we learned, and while you laughed at our primitive technology, we were building something better than weapons. What do you want?" The chief speaker's voice had lost all its authority. "The same thing all species want. A fair chance. No more corrupt trade agreements. No more exploitation. No more rule by force." The station shook as more ships arrived. But these weren't warships. They were diplomatic vessels from every species in Council space coming to demand change. Walker looked at Tom. "Send the message to Earth. It's time for Phase 2. As the Council's power crumbled around them, Walker remembered something his predecessor had told him. The greatest victory isn't destroying your enemy's strength. It's making that strength pointless. The Council had laughed at humans, thinking them weak. Now they were learning that true strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the quietest revolution is the most powerful. 1 month after the Council's fall, the Celestial Forum looked very different. The high platforms had been removed, replaced by a circular arrangement where all species sat at the same level. Walker stood at the entrance, watching representatives arrive for the first session of the new Galactic Assembly. "Hard to believe it's only been a month," Tom said, standing beside him. He was no longer wearing a Council aide's uniform. but the formal dress of his people's new government. Walker nodded. Change comes quickly once people lose their fear. The station had been transformed. Where once the Council's private security forces had patrolled, now representatives from all species worked together to maintain peace. The corrupt trade systems had been dismantled, replaced by fair agreements that benefited everyone. Ambassador Walker called the familiar voice. It was Representative Green from the Delton system, his leaf-like skin now a healthy shade of bright green. The Outer Sector Alliance wanted to thank you again. Our economies are already recovering now that we're not paying those illegal fees. Walker smiled. Earth is happy to help, though I hear your scientists have made some interesting discoveries of their own. Green's leaves rustled with pride. Once we were free to share our research, we found that many species had developed amazing technologies in secret. We were all too afraid of the Council to reveal them before. The chamber's bells chimed, calling everyone to the first session. Walker took his seat, no higher or lower than anyone else's. The former chief speaker sat across the room, his golden scales dulled, but his eyes showing a new understanding. The first session of the Galactic Assembly is now in session, announced the new moderator, chosen by vote from all member species. Our first order of business is ratifying the new Charter of Rights. Walker looked at his data pad. A real one now, not the simplified version he'd used to fool the Council. On its screen, he could see messages from Earth expressing pride in what had been accomplished. Not through force, but through patience, intelligence, and the careful revelation of truth. Would Earth's representative like to speak? The moderator asked. Walker stood, looking around the chamber at faces that no longer showed fear or submission. A month ago, this chamber was divided between rulers and ruled. The Council thought their power was absolute because it had lasted for so long. They laughed at newer species, thinking us primitive because we were young. He paused, letting his words sink in. But age doesn't equal wisdom, just as advanced weapons don't equal strength. Earth came here not to conquer or rule, but to change a system that had forgotten its purpose, to help all species grow together. The former chief speaker stood up. We were wrong, he said, his voice humble. We thought ruling through fear made us strong. Instead, it made us weak. We stopped advancing because we thought we didn't need to. Walker nodded to him. The past is past. What matters now is building a better future. Earth's technology isn't just about stopping weapons or breaking corrupt systems. It's about helping species work together. He pressed a button on his pad. The chamber's center lit up with a hologram showing the gateway designs Earth had been working on. Technology that would allow faster, safer travel between all worlds. This is just the beginning, Walker continued. Every species here has something to contribute. Ideas and discoveries they've kept hidden out of fear. Together, we can build something greater than the Council ever imagined. The chamber erupted in applause. Representatives from hundreds of worlds, old and new, large and small, rose to their feet. Where once there had been fear and division, now there was hope and unity. Tom leaned over to Walker. You know, they're still laughing about how they underestimated Earth. Walker smiled. Let them laugh. But this time, it's not at us. It's with us. And that makes all the difference. Outside the station's windows, ships from all species flew together through space, their paths no longer separated by artificial boundaries. The galaxy was changing, growing, evolving. And it had all started because the Council had laughed at the wrong species.